Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to Fenwick Elliott's masterclass in contracting for NetZero. This is the last webinar of our NetZero Live day, and in fact we've got another day tomorrow as well. So if you've been on previous webinars, you know the format. If not, I'm Chloe McCulloch, I'm Buildings Editor, and I'm just doing the introductions here, but we have a really great panel for you. So we've got Stacey Sinclair, who's a partner at Fenwick Elliott. We've got Jeremy Glover, also a partner, and Mark Pantry, who's a senior associate. And they're going to be discussing contractual obligations, legislation, policy, challenges around technology, all the essentials, so that you get a really practical guide for how to do contracting around net zero. That's probably as much as I know about the topic, so I'm going to be watching the presentation with anticipation and making notes. But just to say to the audience, if any issues do come up that you feel you'd like a little bit more explanation around, do post questions. We'll try to find time. We'll see how the presentations go. If we don't have time for a Q&A session, we do have the questions on record, so Fenwick Elliott will have them and can get back to you if they can answer any of those questions. So do post questions throughout. It'll be really interesting to see your thoughts, comments, ideas around it. But for now, I'm going to hand over to the panel. Over to you guys.
Great. Thank you very much, Chloe, for that introduction. And thank you all very much for joining us today. We thought it might be sensible to set out straight away what this webinar is and what this webinar is not. As you can see from the slide, it's not going to be a webinar about COP26 and the conference last week. It's not going to be a webinar about discussing the politicians' promises for what they're worth, or made or not made at the conference. Also, slightly sadly, we're not going to be looking at some of the green technologies and advances needed to achieve net zero. I mean, they're absolutely fascinating and a lot of progress is being made, but some of those advances will have been discussed on some of the other webinars which are part of the Building Net Zero Live webinar sessions. So what this webinar is, we're going to have a look at some of the changes you might see as a result of the sustained move towards net zero, and that's all changes in relation to procurement practice, and also possibly changes to your construction contract. I mean, of course, I'm obviously not going to deny, it'd be interesting to see what actually does come out of the COP conference in Glasgow. But as you can see on the next slide, the comments made by the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, what he said in Glasgow. Paris, the 2016 conference built the arena. Glasgow started the race, and tonight the starting gun was fired. Personally, that sounds a little bit disappointing, and query that what the actual success of the Glasgow summit was. And particularly, you know, it's something that we'll wait and see. But I think what it's worth stressing, what should be stressed, is those comments, they're not a reflection on the considerable steps already taken within the construction industry as part of the move towards carbon and resource neutrality. And as those steps are taken, I think it's important that procurement and contracts keep pace with the advances and aren't seen as a brake on progress. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons for the webinar today. And it's sort of, you know, one of the questions we're going to ask is, what are the changes that we're going to see to procurement? As looking on the next slide, and it's why we wanted to look at some of the likely changes that you may see, and also highlight some of the issues that you're going to come across. Now, just last week, there's a significant planning development, which I think is very relevant indeed to employers, clients, and designers, and that was the refusal of planning permission for the Tulip, one of the potential big towers in the City of London. And the quote on the screen there, it's from the letter of refusal. And one of the reasons given for refusing planning permission was that although it recognised that extensive measures were taken to minimise carbon emissions during construction, these would not outweigh what was thought to be a highly unsustainable concept. And there's reference made to using vast quantities of reinforced concrete for foundations in the lift shaft. And there's reference to the purpose of the building, transporting visitors to as high a level as possible. And I think this letter is important because it's believed to be the first time the government has cited embodied carbon in a planning decision letter. But looking around some of the aspects of the project, the scheme wasn't carbon neutral. It involved the demolition of a building that was only 20 years old. You think of recycling and these using you recycle your rubbish. Well, one of the ways to carbon neutrality is actually reusing resources, making use of what's already there. And I suppose, being slightly cynical, the tulip was already a controversial project. It had been rejected by Mayor Sadiq Khan, so it's easy for the government to take a hit at this. But I think it's a sign of the times. You can see on the quote, the attack on concrete. You can see the attack on the purpose of the building. There's also reference in the letters to the fact that nearby projects had a highly valuable employment floor space. And what this all means is that projects, not just major projects probably, are going to need to set out their sustainability credentials. And then the building regulations too. They're going to matter. As you can see from the next slide, there's already been a consultation stage in relation to new guidance for approved document L, which is all about conservation of fuel and power. And that's for new and existing dwellings and buildings. But have a look on Google. Have a look at www.partz.uk. The idea of there being a new approved document Z. And this Part Z is supported by many of the leading players in the construction industry. They're looking to reduce embodied carbon impacts in line with the NetZero 2050 pathway. And these people, they talk about the need for firm, supportive legislation, which sets out a clear requirement to measure, report, and reduce the impacts. Now, you're going to hear a lot about those words, the idea of reporting and monitoring of progress. That's going to be one of the things I think we're all going to talk about over the next hour or so. I'm also going to have a look at what a contractual carbon budget might be. But it's interesting there that there's talk about the need perhaps for legislation, or at least changing or introducing new building regulations to achieve that. So here we are, we're looking at procurement, we're looking at the beginning, the start of a project. And one of the interesting developments, I think, in relation to that recently has been the introduction of the construction playbook. And that's something that Stacey's going to be looking at.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. So as Jeremy just said, I'm going to be coming on to the construction playbook, but what I really want to touch on is what's happened, what are the highlights over the past year in terms of procurement. Now, just to start with, we've of course heard a lot about how the construction industry is just such a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and has such a big part to play if we're going to achieve these targets that we've been hearing about. Now, I hope it goes without saying that if projects are going to achieve these targets and sustainable outcomes, such as minimizing the use of resources, as Jeremy just said, and energy, reducing waste and increasing biodiversity, strategic and detailed consideration of the planning, design, and procurement is going to be needed right from the outset of any project. Now, this could be a new build project or the refurbishment of existing assets. And following on from procurement, which we'll come to in due course, the contracts themselves. So as we can see, the government is aligned with this view of you need to get it right from the outset, and that's including procurement. And I say this because of what we have here, the construction playbook, that was published last, for those of you who haven't heard of it, that was published last December 2020. And this is the government's guidance on the sourcing and contracting of public works. And it has a focus on getting it right from the start, and has numerous references to procurement throughout. So first, I'm going to just an overview. Right from the outset, it's talking about building back greener. And it's requiring contracting authorities to have this overarching sustainability framework, systems and processes in place to ensure that their projects and programs are delivered to these targets. And now I just want to point out that what it's saying is that the contracting authorities should adopt the use of whole life carbon assessments, and it refers to PAS 2080. I'm going to come back to that in a second, to understand and minimize the greenhouse gas emissions footprint of projects and programs throughout their life cycle. Now, I'm just pointing out that PAWS 2080. Now, this came about following the infrastructure carbon review in 2013, where it was identified the infrastructure is responsible for, at that point, is responsible for over 50% of the UK's carbon emissions, and therefore PAWS 2080 was designed specifically to address the management of carbon in infrastructure. And the UK Green Construction Board launched this specification in May 2016. And it looks at the whole life cycle of carbon used on projects and promotes reduction of carbon, reduced cost in infrastructure delivery, and a culture of challenging infrastructure in the value chain where innovation can be fostered. So I just wanted to set that, and as the construction playbook does, its tone at the outset. Now, moving on in the construction playbook to modern methods of construction. And here we see procurement is the enabler, and it's really at the heart of it all. The playbook highlights the need for procurement to support an investment in modern methods of construction, for example, adopting longer-term contracting and favoring off-site construction. The playbook also introduces procuring construction projects based on something called, it's quite interesting if you haven't heard of it before, product platforms. Now, that is a platform comprising standardized and interoperable components and assemblies, the requirements for which will be part of a digital component catalog. Now, I would suggest this is rather game-changing. This is not a position where we're at right now. What it's doing, it's going on, it sets out, you can see at page 20 and look in further detail here. It's requiring contracting authorities to collaborate and find opportunities, not only for their own platform solutions, but also for ways in which they can do cross-sector platforms. For example, by using platforms that enable interoperability and components across different sectors. Now, this idea of product platform is fundamentally different, as I mentioned a moment ago. Here we've got this idea of designers using pre-designed components from other designers, and this extending into manufacturing. Now, this might be novel for the construction industry. It's not novel elsewhere in the manufacturing world, such as the automotive industry and otherwise, but to come to terms with it in construction may take some time and teamwork. Now, this, of course, will raise legal issues along the way and practical commercial considerations, such as who will be responsible for this digital component catalog and who's going to keep it up to date. Are there going to be issues for the responsibility of the interoperability? Who retains the intellectual property rights for these digital components, which are going to be used across a number of projects going forward? And how easy is it going to be to determine defective design versus defective manufacturing? Now, that's not a new question. We see it time and time again. Who's going to be liable? Is there going to be an increased complexity here? There will be other questions, no doubt, and obviously clearly a topic for another session. But I just wanted to point out here the significant change in procurement that the construction playbook is highlighting. One other aspect of the construction playbook is a section on effective contracting. And this is how contracting authorities should, with their advisors, establish the most appropriate commercial approach and procurement strategy that optimizes long-term value and involves all team members early enough for them to contribute to this value. And it goes on to say that before issuing the tender, stress testing, and peer reviewing the draft contract, particularly to check for unintended consequences. And in doing so, ensure that the contract terms are not unintentionally limiting innovation, sustainable supply chains, or investment in modern methods of construction. And this really comes back to this, this concept, this need for teamwork, engaging the supply chain and designers and advisors very early on in the process if we're going to have these positive outcomes and achieve these targets. And indeed, just to show you a diagram of figure 4 right at the end of the construction playbook, which shows you that getting your legal team, legal advisors involved right from the outset, right across their 4 key policies is going to be essential if we're going to achieve this. So those are just a few points in the construction playbook on procurement. And there's a number of other suggestions within the playbook for both contract and contractual obligations least of which including a suggestion of a project scoreboard, which should form part of project documentation, but one for another time. I do encourage you to have a read of the playbook, which is free and available online. Now, moving on, that was December 2020. Moving forward to July 2021, we have the UK Construction Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan, where she listed 3 government actions to ensure that contractors commit to reducing their carbon contributions. And she set out those 3 that you can see there on the screen, one being a carbon exclusion measure, or warning that companies without net zero plans or will have not committed to a net zero plan by 2050 will be barred from bidding for public sector work. And this policy will apply to contracts above 5 million. Then she talked about a national procurement policy statement. Public sector buyers must consider how their procurement can tackle climate change. And then she spoke of a government evaluation process, which you can see set out there. Now, fast forward to September 21, we see this in action. We see this coming in. And the minister's words, as we can see, have materialized. And from September 21, we had the public policy note 0621 come into force on the 30th of September. And from then, to be eligible to bid for major UK government contracts over 5 million a year, tendering organizations, and that's including contractors and consultants, will have to commit to achieving net zero by 2050. And this entails publishing clear and credible carbon reduction plans by measuring and reporting on their scope of 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Now, the key issue to be assessed is whether a bidder has taken steps to understand their environmental impact and carbon footprint relative to the delivery of that contract. Now, I will say that the anticipated average value per year is determined by the advertised contract value over the life of the contract. So, for example, a procurement contract for a 4-year term with a total value of 21 million would be within the scope, even if that value in the first year was under 5 million. And the carbon reduction plan does not replace, just to be clear, the carbon reduction plan does not replace existing reporting or calculation of an organization's carbon footprint, but rather it's a summary document to demonstrate compliance. So one thing I just wanted to touch on quickly, just when we get to October 2021, we did see the publication of greening finance come out. Now, this was as a result of the Chancellor of the Exchequer when he announced plans back in July to introduce new sustainability disclosure requirements. Now, these represent additional disclosure requirements to those required by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures framework. Now, the government's aim here is for these sustainability disclosure requirements to be fully integrated, a fully integrated regime that works smoothly across all sectors of the economy. And within that, relevant regulators and government departments will determine the precise scope and timing of the requirements and the reporting detail, coming back again to this reporting aspect, subject to the relevant consultation process. Now, what I think what's being aimed for here is a mandatory disclosure requirement in annual reports. Now, I only raise it briefly, query what the impact is going to be on construction, but no doubt it will impact future developments because of financing, therefore something to look out for. And just finally, now, quite recently, last week, November 2021, we saw the UK Green Building Council has launched their roadmap, the NetZero Whole Life Carbon Roadmap for the UK built environment. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it yet, but basically it's detailing the necessary actions government and industry must take if we're going to achieve net zero across the sector. And this roadmap, it quantifies for the first time the specific emission reductions that we need to see across the subsectors of the built environment. And that will need to take place year on year if we're going to meet the 2050 deadline. Now, the analysis doesn't just take into account domestic emissions, but also emissions on the consumption of imported construction products and materials. The roadmap establishes a net zero emission budget and trajectory to 2050, and it's consistent with the wider UK carbon targets and budgets. Now, it's set out in 4 documents, which I've listed for you there on the screen. And I just wanted to pull out two procurement points in this roadmap that's just been released. And here are a few extracts from the roadmap. And you can see on several occasions, it's talking about including carbon reduction targets and reporting commitments explicitly in all procurement documents. Now, this being a deliverable of the design and procurement process. And here we have another reference to PAS 2080 as the reference standard. So what we're seeing, and then it goes on to talk about carbon baselines and so forth. And finally, one thing that's going to be interesting coming into play, which is also referencing, is this adoption of a design for performance approach to new buildings. So as you can see there, developers should update their briefs to include energy intensity targets aligned with industry targets and request a design for performance approach from design teams and contractors, seeking to include contractual targets where possible. So on that note, I've gone through about, whizzed through about a year's worth of procurement issues. But now, if we're going to embed them within our contracts, we're going to need to be alive to various certain issues. And I think, Jeremy, you're going to, oh, sorry, there was one more slide there. You can't really see under the screen here. I would have a look, and you can see these QR codes embedded in the slides here if you want to get to some of these documents quickly. But I would encourage you to have a look at some of the graphs within this roadmap. Really interesting and really helpful, showing the new regulations tightening up, building regulations and otherwise that are going to need to come into play if we're going to achieve these targets. And that's procurement, but how are we going to deal with this contractually? Jeremy, I think you'll take from here.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, Stacey. And of course, you've seen the reference there on the previous slide of Stacey's relation to building regulations. Check your contracts to see whether you are required to ensure that your project complies with the building regulations as they are updated as you go along. You may well find that they are. So we're going to have a look at some of the potential legal and contractual issues. I think it's fair to say the contractual landscape currently is a little bit immature, but it's developing quickly. And I think we're going to be able to see, you're going to see an introduction of a number of different types of contractual obligations. It's going to be crucial that these are focused on design obligations as well as the construction and operational phases. And it's not just going to be part of the specifications. There's going to be a lot of information is going to be in the employer's requirements, contract data about sort of the targets and what needs to be achieved. But you're also going to see clauses appearing elsewhere within the contracts, and they can lead to potential, I suppose, sort of termination, potential dispute type clauses. So we've already talked about pre-tender benchmarking, the requirements that parties are going to have to fulfill before they can actually even tender for the contract. And it's not just about carbon footprint. It might just be a contractor's practice. Do they have a record of using sustainable, safe working practices on site? What commitments have they made to adhere to sustainable policies? And by commitment, I think increasingly it's going to be a genuine call to action. It's not just going to be phrases that look good on a website. You're going to look for what's being included within warranties. It's going to be existing, maybe even historic compliance with environmental legislation. Obviously, any contract, doesn't matter whether it's sort of, we're looking specifically at sustainable carbon neutral type obligations. Think about back-to-back obligations with subcontractors and suppliers. Now, I think something that's going to be an absolutely key point that we're going to be looking at is the obligation to do things. Is there going to be an obligation that a party must do something? Is there going to be an obligation that a party ought to do their best to do this? And lawyers talk about reasonable endeavours. People they talk about best endeavours. There's a range of options that you find in contracts. You know, I'll try. A contractor will use its reasonable endeavours, best, you see best reasonable endeavours, all reasonable endeavours. Ultimately, you've got your absolute, a party must do this. You're likely to see the must do this obligation watered down a little bit. So that's why we sort of focused here on best endeavours, and it's not an absolute obligation. And it's not the next best thing. A contractor or party who's required to use their best endeavours doesn't have to go beyond the realms of what's actually reasonable, what's actually achievable. But there may be a cost to that, something to think about when you're putting together a tender. You are entitled to have regard for your own commercial interests, but it's, you know, it doesn't expect too much. It's not going to expect you undermining your own commercial standing, and you don't try things if they're going to have no likelihood of being successful. But if you're being required to do things to try and achieve a net zero outcome, look to see whether it's must, look to see whether it's reasonable endeavours, and try and understand what the obligation is that you're being asked to achieve. But then some of the other potential contract issues that you're going to see, independent audits. We're talking monitoring, we're talking about reporting. There may be new contractual roles here for the parties that actually have to do the audits, who have to actually monitor compliance with agreed forecast assessment of emissions. And if we're talking about agreed forecast assessment of emissions, well, how do you do it? What are you actually reporting against? What are the standards? So therefore, there's a need for certainty, need for clarification. You need to understand what you're being asked to achieve, because these targets, you can see them that they're going to be embedded into the contract. You can see you're going to end up with performance-related liquidated damages. If you don't achieve the targets, there are potentially going to be penalties. Conversely, if you do achieve the targets, or you better the targets, then there's going to, you know, look to see if there are incentives that are built into the project. But ultimately, again, if there's non-compliance with the targets, non-compliance with the plans, well, you may find in your contract that that's going to lead to a right to suspend or terminate for non-compliance. And one of the potential areas where you might be looking at targets, pain gain incentives, or maybe ultimately right to suspend, is in relation to the carbon budget. And that's something that Mark's going to talk about for a little bit now.
Thanks, Jeremy. So let's look at a practical example. Let's say we've got a client who wants to undertake construction of a new office block. And as part of that construction, they want the project to meet an overall carbon budget. And that carbon budget could feed into the organization's overall carbon footprint, or it can just be used as a kind of measure of that particular project's success or failure. And at the outset, I suppose you've got to ask, how is that budget determined? How is it benchmarked? How is it measured contractually? Can it be adjusted through the project? And what are the sanctions, as Jeremy was saying, if it's not met? What are those contractual sanctions? If we go on to the next slide, we can see an example clause, which we're going to, I think we'll have quite a few mentions of the Chancery Lane project throughout this webinar, but this is called Tristan's clause. It can be accessed through the QR code on the screen, the full clause, but I've just extracted some of the provisions there. It's intended as an amendment to the JCT design and build contract, but it can be used for any contract. And it's a strict obligation on the contractor to carry out the works. So as this is a design and build contract, that's both design and construction of the works, so that the employer's carbon budget is not exceeded. And if it is exceeded, then liquidated damages are payable per gram, or I think it says per ton of carbon over that budget. Now, with my contractor hat on, I would ask a few more questions about this clause, I think. Mainly, what is the carbon budget? Is it achievable? There's no point signing up to something which a contractor knows that they can't achieve. Who measures the carbon budget, and how is it measured? As Jeremy was saying, perhaps this is an independent third party, perhaps it's the employer's agent, perhaps it's a completely new role that we've never heard of before that is responsible for measuring the carbon budget. And we mentioned before about a contractor reporting, submitting monthly reports. The clause suggests monthly reports by the contractor, but is that the contractor kind of marking his own homework? And how does the contractor differentiate projects? For example, if a contractor uses off-site manufacture, where there are multiple projects being constructed on the same site, how does a contractor or a subcontractor differentiate between the carbon emissions for different projects? How are those all kind of totaled up and divvied up? And is there any way to change the carbon budget? If the client suddenly says instructs an additional floor onto the building, presumably the carbon budget changes, but in what ways does it change? How do you calculate that additional carbon for that additional floor? We see with liquidated damages provisions, for example, for delay, there are extensions of time provisions, but that is kind of a known quantity. Similarly, we also see liquidated damages provisions for target areas, but if the target areas are increased, how does that correlate? So I think ultimately these kind of clauses, they're an excellent starting point. I think we'll say that throughout the Chancery Lane discussion. I think they're a good starting point, but they don't have all the answers. So I think we'll definitely see more development here. I think Stacey's going to very briefly talk about the Chancery Lane project.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good time to tell the audience what is the Chancery Lane project. I mean, because we're starting to get now into contractual obligations. How can we amend standard forms or whichever contractual documents you're working to? So what is the Chancery Lane project? Now, fundamentally, I would say this project really demonstrates true collaboration and genuine teamwork at its very best. I mean, this is a project where we have the collaborative effort of lawyers from around the world coming together, whose vision is where a world that contracts and enables solutions for climate change. So you've got 1,300 lawyers, 260 organizations. They've come together to generate practical contractual clauses that are ready to be incorporated into either law firm precedents or commercial agreements to deliver climate solutions. Now, these clauses are free, they're publicly available, and they're on the website that you can see there on the screen. And these clauses, they're not just for the construction industry. There are other practice areas such as commercial, corporate, insurance, finance, and importantly, there's also clauses that are covering the supply chain. If we're going to achieve these targets, we have to include the supply chain right throughout. Now, further to Mark's discussion of Tristan's clause, I've set out some further examples just on the screen. I won't go through them, but you can see there are suggestions that you could incorporate clauses in relation to incentivizing contractors, in relation to green modifications. There's waste management provisions, and watch this space in terms of further provisions on modern or contractual clauses on modern methods of construction and NEC clauses. Now, as Mark said, whilst these clauses are just a starter for 10, and there's still a lot to do, I would suggest that the sheer establishment of this project is hugely significant and really demonstrates the importance of contractually managing your obligations and expectations if we're going to tackle this monumental and game-changing environmental issues that the industry is facing. And it's really just fantastic to see the legal industry coming together in this way. A few more, there's Tristan's clause and Francis's clause on that slide, but I would encourage you to go to the Chancery Lane website. So now we're really getting into the bulk of it, the standard form contracts And Jeremy's going to take us into this a bit further.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stacey. And it will be interesting over time to see how the clauses that come from the Chancery Lane project find their way into some of the standard forms for construction that we're all familiar with. Because I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, in relation to sustainability, net zero, etc., the contract landscape is relatively immature. The Framework Alliance contract is unusual. It already makes provision for introducing sustainability targets to their contract. It talks about project briefs. There needs to be a project brief in relation to sustainability, also in relation to operation of the completed project. And it's the operation side quite often of these projects, these contracts, where some of the balancing comes back, where you're able to recover some of the, the carbon and use of other sort of carbon and other materials which have been used during the construction process as a way to sort of balance off what's already been used. And what's interesting in the FAC1 contract is that there's a defined commitment to sustainability, and it's quite helpful to see here a definition of sustainability in construction terms, and that's sort of set out in the FAC1 contract. And it says that sustainability is set out on the slide. Sustainability is measures intended to reduce carbon emissions. They're to reduce the use of energy and or natural or man-made resources, improve waste management, improve employment and training opportunities. People have such an important part to play in the drive towards net zero, and looking to protect, improve condition of the environment and the well-being of people. So it's interesting to see that sort of the definition that's there in the FAC1 form of contract. But the FAC1, it's an overarching contract. With the FAC1, it incorporates the JCT or FIDIC or NEC form of contracts. And what we want to do now is explain the extent to which some of the standard forms are already or not in looking to introduce some sort of new contractual issues. And Mark's going to have a look at the JCT and NEC forms.
Thanks. Yeah, the JCT's approach, and I'll start with the JCT and then go on to the NEC. The JCT's approach has been focused on what it calls sustainability, and that by its very nature is a broad term, and perhaps one which we will see refreshed in the future as future editions of these contracts are released. The JCT often refers to this guidance note, Building a Sustainable Future Together, which was published in 2011, and as far as I can see hasn't been updated. There wasn't a new edition for it in 2016, which is the most recent version of the JCT contracts, and I don't think it's actually available to purchase anymore. The JCT framework agreement acts in a similar way to the FAC1, to be honest. And that includes, as a framework objective, improvements to environmental performance. It includes sustainability, that word again, and reduction in environmental impact. But it's not clear how those objectives are measured, that they are identified as key performance indicators, and the contractor or the parties to the contract have to give a written report. But otherwise, there's kind of no teeth to what a party's failure to measure those key performance indicators, or if they reduce below certain levels. Similarly, clause 16 of the framework agreement requires the parties to reduce the environmental impact and to review the environmental performance. But again, that's kind of limited to explore the ways. There's no obligation. It's intended to be that kind of collaborative approach where the parties come together, they explore ways in which the contract can be made more sustainable, but ultimately there's no requirement for any party to agree a particular route. And then finally, we've got the JCT Constructing Excellence contract, which includes sustainable development and environmental obligations, and it encourages suppliers to suggest particular ways in which environmental performance can be improved, and to provide information as requested. So again, we're talking more kind of collaborative approach rather than strict obligations like we were looking for before in Tristan's clause, which is an amendment to the D&B contract. Those kind of conditions don't exist yet, but they may do in the future, in future editions. Looking now at the NEC, sorry, on that clause, that previous clause, it sets out the particular obligations in the framework agreement, those sustainability framework objectives. In the NEC contracts, there's even less, to be honest, you know, in the standard form. If you look into the literature from NEC about the NEC contracts and sustainability, it's not really mentioned very much, other than the NEC's approach appears to be that this is a kind of inherent benefit of using the NEC contracts, is in that it can be used more sustainably, for a project to achieve more sustainable results. But I think what that means in practice is that the NEC is usually considered to be a more collaborative form of contract compared to the JCT, which is seen as kind of more adversarial. And it means that environmental requirements can be identified as risks. So they could be put on a risk register and that way assigned to the party who is best placed to deal with that risk. And that makes a kind of change from the JCT approach, where it's kind of dumped onto the contractor. You know, it's the contractor's responsibility to deal with it, with environmental requirements. So those kind of risk management processes are, in theory, built into the NEC contracts, and they allow sustainability or environmental requirements to be monitored throughout the project, rather than just kind of looked at the end. And the NEC, you know, with its use of programs, which are updated on a regular basis, it kind of measures progress throughout the project, and that can be used for sustainability and for environmental requirements. We've also seen clients use option X20 of the ECC contract, which is key performance indicators, and that for specific environmental requirements. And putting those in, it kind of gives an incentive for contractors to meet environmental requirements, but also a pain if they don't meet it as well. So I'm going to pass over now to Jeremy, who's going to talk about FIDIC.
Thank you, Mark. And I think what we'll see is that FIDIC adopts a similar approach to the JCT insofar as there are obligations on the contractor, and perhaps currently follows the more NEC approach, and it doesn't say very much yet about the sort the sustainability issues. I mean, currently, as we'll see on the slide, the General Condition Clause 418 deals with the protection of the environment, and it expressly incorporates requirements for the contractor to comply with the applicable law. And I think that's the interesting bit about the current FIDIC form of contract, as different nations bring in different laws to help achieve net zero or move towards net zero, then there's an obligation on the contractor to follow that. Then you get the typical project environmental impact assessments and whatever the standards and set out in the employer's requirements. FIDIC's also got specific requirements to protect the environment and limit damage and nuisance to people and protect property from pollution, as is typical the way with the contract suites. Different contracts have slightly different obligations, and you see within FIDIC difference between all necessary measures to protect the environment, or a party taking under the EPC type contracts reasonable steps to protect the environment. So again, that's coming back to one of the things we were talking earlier, looking specifically to see what your obligation is, the difference between all necessary measures and the difference of then all taking reasonable steps. Now, I think under the contract law, there's actually quite a significant difference there. So aside from any sort of wider provisions of the law, the contractor is not expressly required to limit and think about the wider impact of its work, something that I think contractors are going to become probably expressly required to consider and think about as we move forward generally. Now, with FIDIC, I think everything is changing. And just last week, I think it was, or maybe two weeks ago, FIDIC introduced a climate change charter. And the FIDIC are talking about the need to incorporate low carbon solutions or net zero principles, have these incorporated in the designs. FIDIC are now talking about the need for project procurement and risk allocation to be sort of set out in contracts. Now, FIDIC haven't yet said how this should be done, but FIDIC are now taking active steps to bring forward so they can actually sort of make some recommendations to see how they can enable achievement of carbon reduction. So I think, you know, with FIDIC, it's very much a case of sort of watch this space, but they're aware of what needs to be done. They're taking active sort of steps to achieve that, and they recognise it's all to do with the whole life cycle of a facility. And I think what we're going to see is you're going to see changes to the FIDIC contract conditions. Perhaps you're going to see some of the Chancery Lane ideas filter through. Perhaps you're going to see, you know, easy ways to do this are adoption of the charter itself. What we've got here on the slide, this is interesting. Again, it talks before about being about the people. And it's about you and it's about me. One of the interesting things in the FIDIC Climate Change Charter, they talk about personal behaviours. They talk about an individual. They talk about an individual thinking for themselves, you know, regardless of the company you work for, whatever else, you know, think about personal behaviour. Think about expanding your own knowledge on climate science, climate change. If you're involved in a project, you're designing a project, think about the total carbon load. Become an advocate for net zero in your workplace. Work with your team members. And I think about FIDIC talking about the importance of education. They're also looking at the importance of sort of working to integrate climate considerations into the project process, and they're looking very much in relation to the operational side of the project, and sort of moving on, sort of looking at sort of some of the other things that you can see in the climate change charter. They're looking at the operational side, integrating climate considerations to the project process. How can thinking about how climate events might impact future performance. Now, I do appreciate in saying this that you know, there's a danger for this is aspirational. It's not very legal. It's not very contractual. And what you're going to see is these aspirations being sort of crafted into contract clauses, crafted into actual obligations. And I think on the next slide, just having a quick look at some of the other things that the you know, FIDIC are talking about. But you know, but they're talking about the delivery of a service function. We're talking about operation, and so we're moving there into the idea of moving into takeover, practical completion, whatever you want to call it. And you know, that's where I think you're going to see a particular change being gradually introduced as a result of some of the concepts that we're talking about. And I think Stacey's going to have a look at that now.
Thanks, Jeremy. So if the question is, you know, what about completion, taking over practical completion? The first, if I can move the slides, apologies. We're talking about these issues that in relation to net zero. I mean, what the first thing we need to do is keep in mind the government soft landings document. I don't know how many of you have come across it. You may have heard of it previously, but for those who have, just be alive or alert to the fact that it has been updated recently in line with ISO 19650. Now, the purpose of this document is to help enable a smooth transition from construction to operation. It's also meant to help clients assure the performance of an asset and inform the success of future projects. Now, it's also, and many of you have heard this idea of the golden thread, it's also fundamental to maintaining the golden thread of data and information by aligning the interests of those who commission, design, and construct with those who use and maintain these projects and assets. Now, this document is for public sector clients and projects, but I suggest that, its benefits, the benefits of this approach are going to be of use and highly informative for the private sector as well. Now, looking specifically at completion, the potential amendments in contracts in the UK are likely to align with this approach of soft landings to the completion and performance reviews of post-completion. Now, firstly, what is soft landings? And I've put the definition up there. I mean, it's really that process for the gradual handover of a new or refurbished facility, where a defined period of aftercare by the design and construction team is an owner's requirement that is planned and developed from the outset of a project. Now, the scope and principles of the government's soft landings first includes this smooth transition from construction into handover and closeout and then into facility operation. But also this list here that I won't go through given the time, but importantly, this list is referring to clear, measurable targets for the facility's performance outcomes, which aligns with the business case and a post-occupancy evaluation, and of course, smooth transition of data, which I just referred to. But importantly, it's talking about a period of aftercare. Now, this period of aftercare, I think we need to all be alive to. I mean, in particular, understand how is this sitting with your contract's definition of completion, and perhaps when retention monies are due, and so on and so forth. This period of aftercare is going to be becoming quite. I put a slide on that. Quite interesting going forward. I don't have table 2 on the slides here. But throughout the document, in various different clauses, it's talking about the benefits of adopting the government's soft landings approach. One being the on-site availability of design and construction delivery teams in an initial aftercare, typically 6 to 8 weeks following handover, supporting operational optimization. And then ongoing support of design and construction delivery teams during an extended period of aftercare, typically 3 years, enabling measurement of performance targets and fine-tuning of systems. Now, this does feed into the role of the GSL champion, which I won't go into today, but it is something to keep in mind when you're contracting, both in terms of time and cost and the definition of completion. And just finally, I want to bring your attention to part 4 of the document around thematic outcomes and measurement. Again, we're hearing about this measurement and reporting obligations or approach. Now, the GSL requires the definition of target performance outcomes at the outset of a project. And then British Standard 8536, clause 4.3, recommends performance outcomes to be considered in the following, in 4 categories. There's environmental, social, security, and economic. But what I've set out for you there is the environmental performance outcomes. And these targets are to be regularly reviewed and evaluated according to the project's information exchange program. So the handover and aftercare activities should be used to continue the evaluation of performance and assuring targets are achieved. So for the past few minutes, I've been speaking about an approach to completion and takeover, which is fundamentally different to a number of projects that you may be working with now. Now, if this is going to, as Mark has used the phrase previously, if this is going to have any teeth, this will need to be embedded contractually. And now I think Mark is going to take us through an example of just how that can be done.
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah. If we look at, I think if as Stacey was saying, if it's going to have any teeth, you're going to have a schedule amendments to the standard form D&B contract or Z clauses to the NEC contract. If we look at the Chancery Lane project and Mary's clause, there's a specific obligation in there. It almost takes a step back and says you cannot contractually achieve practical completion until you have met the environmental requirements and met the energy efficiency obligations. So in Mary's clause, there's an obligation for the contractor to meet an EPC rating, say A. If he doesn't meet that, then practical completion cannot be achieved under the contract. He's got to effectively go back, retrofit so as to achieve rating A, presumably taking the hit on delay damages and also the hit on his own costs to complete those works. So that's a very strong contractual way, and there's nothing to stop that approach. That is the kind of alternate to the soft landings that Stacey was talking about. It's less collaborative. It's more one objective that the contractor has got to hit in order to achieve practical completion. There are issues with this approach, as I'm sure you're all thinking. EPC ratings aren't a perfect measure of sustainability of a project, and again, from our experience, EPC ratings are sometimes quite variable, and you can get different consultants to give different responses. So who measures that, and what are they measured against? And I think on the next slide, it just goes into the specifics there. If you want to look at the clause on the previous slide, the QR code takes you straight to Mary's clause, which has all those provisions.
Thank you, Mark. And just very, very briefly to touch on dispute resolution. I mean, just by way of example, just to demonstrate that the things we're talking about, they affect each and every industry. As we can see from the next slide, that within the dispute resolution sphere, there's something called the greener litigation pledge. You'll find most law firms are signing up to it. Some of the some things that we say we're going to do, they're all obvious. Effectively, use less paper. But if you look at the bottom, use suppliers and service providers who are committed to reducing their carbon footprint wherever possible and appropriate. Well, that goes right back to what Stacey was talking about right near the beginning of our webinar today, talking about procurement obligations, looking for parties who are genuinely committed to reducing their carbon footprint. So it's applying everywhere. I mean, it's not just construction industry, it's applying, these things, they apply to everyone across all the walks of industries. And so I suppose by way of 2 or 3 very, very, very brief conclusions to this afternoon, do have a look at the Chancery Lane Project's climate contract playbook. We've referred to it a number of times for very good reason. It's a great idea, and there's some very interesting clauses, and you may well be able to add to the discussion. It's a collaboration. Everyone wants to make things better. In terms of future contractual obligations, well, the next slide's got a list. None of the items on that list is going to be a surprise to any of you, having heard what we had to say. The importance of monitoring, the importance of reporting, the importance of there being consequences if targets are not met. That's going to be pretty fundamental when these type of measures are introduced to your contracts. And finally, as we've said, JCT guidance note, good start. As always with this type of thing, the devil's in the detail. Look to see what you're actually being asked to achieve. What are how are you actually being asked to achieve it? Must you do it? Is it an absolute obligation? Are you actually able to do it? Reporting obligations there, as I've said, it's fundamental. But as we've also said, We've looked at the procurement, we've looked at contracts, but it's people. We have to change mindsets. We have to change ways of working. Collaboration, innovation, technology. They're no longer words. We've actually got to be doing it. And we've given you some good examples today of how that's happening within the contractual legal profession. And we know that as part of the Building Net Zero webinar series over today and tomorrow, there have been a number of other great examples of how the construction industry are working together. And that's the real way forward. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was really fascinating, and I think a really great way to round off the first day of Net Zero Live. I think we've heard today lots of different perspectives, ideas from construction experts, but to hear that the legal profession is really getting their head around it and collaborating, coming up with clauses. And I guess what's going to be really interesting is just seeing how those clauses come through into real life contracts and the practical advice that you've given, I think, to really think about the risk that you're taking on and to really understand what you're being signed up to is definitely worth underlining. So thank you so much to Stacey, Mark and Jeremy, and to Fenwick Elliott. And hopefully people have found this really useful. If you've got colleagues who you think will want the slides, I know we've had lots of questions about, are the slides available? Yes, they will be available on demand, and we will forward any questions that we haven't managed to ask right here and right now onto Fenwick Elliott. But I think they were around these things around final certificates and all of those sorts of things, and understanding that process. So I think a lot of what the presentations talked about did probably cover those topics. So I hope that's been useful for everybody. That's all we've got time for today, but do come back tomorrow for more of Net Zero Live. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe.